Hi, I wanted to take a little bit of time and just talk about the second assignment. I'm sure you've had some questions about it. You're going to take two letter forms and you're going to overlap them on top of each other. And part of what you're working for is an interesting figure-ground relationship. One of those letters should be the ground, and one of the other letters should act as the figure. On top of that first letter's ground. So there's some rules that you kind of need to keep in mind. The letters have to be flatly colored, either black or white. You can't split the design or add artificial geometry. And you can't distort the letter forms. You can't stretch them out beyond what they were originally. Now you can close up any counters. Counters are the holes in the letter forms, so you can close those if you get a better figure-ground relationship doing that. You can also take the edge of a letter and extend it to the edge of the page, if that makes sense, to increase a little bit more ground. But what I wanted to do today was show you the importance of planning and doing some thumbnails. And a lot of times when people start thumbnails, they don't get a lot out of it, and I think it's because they do the thumbnails improperly. So I wanted to show you kind of a series that I've drawn, with each one kind of an improving thumbnail for this particular project. So I'm going to take some time and show you those, and also give you an idea of what cropping around a letter form can do in terms of its figure-ground relationship. Now here, I've just taken the letter A, and on the left, I've surrounded it by ground, and on the right, I've cropped in a bit. Notice how the one on the right gets a little more active. We start to notice the negative space around the letter A in addition to the letter itself. That's really helpful. Down below, I've now filled in that ground black, or sketched lines, and the figure is white. By reversing this, it increases the ambiguity between what's background and foreground. Those little black triangles we become aware of almost as figures. We can still understand this as an A. There's enough information being provided that we can still see this as an A, but we're also noticing, the shapes, the negative space as well as the positive space. A good designer will provide both those things, good, strong, negative and positive relationships. And then in this last piece, I just rotated, and that's acceptable for this project. Notice how by rotating within that space, it becomes a little more interesting to look at. You might not do that with all of yours, but that's a good thing to try, just by taking it and tilting it. So again, you can't stretch the letter forms. You can scale them up and down uniformly. You can't stretch them, but you can rotate them and you can flip them. And if you do that, you can get some pretty interesting looking design. If you notice the triangle in the upper left-hand corner, it now really starts to take off and have an interesting relationship with the counter of the A. What I've drawn here at the top are just some examples of thumbnail drawings that I get from students from time to time. I've drawn them myself, but in this particular project, we just have two letter forms. We have no structure of the format or the page, how they live in that page. And you can kind of see it doesn't really give you much to work with. We just have a couple letter forms, and the relationship is really minimal. We have no idea what fonts are being used or figure ground other than just this basic stick figure. In this next set, I've improved it a little bit by just taking the same drawings and drawing a little bit of format around them. And you can see here now at least we start to get an idea of how these letters are going to fit in that space. Figure ground really hasn't been established yet, but we at least get a sense of boundaries and cropping. So figure ground, it's stronger just in that it's surrounded. On this next set, now I've drawn out the letters just kind of as spaces rather than as lines, so that we get a sense of spatial use on the page. And as we look at this, look at how AW, all of a sudden, it doesn't fit in there. And by the way, as I'm drawing these rectangles, I'm trying to keep them the proportion of the assignment. So in this case, that's 8 by 10. And we start to get a better understanding of how things will fit together, the K and the H, for example. But the other issue with this is that this assignment, you're supposed to use just 3 different types of fonts from the serif category: old style, transitional, or modern. And obviously this line doesn't show that. So down in the next example, I do basically the same sketch as I did above, but now I've put on some little serifs, and I'm still kind of experimenting with this. Some of these are starting to look good, and some of them aren't going to work. Let's drop down again. Next set. So this is the next set where there's a little bit of improvement. Notice that the thumbnails have gotten progressively bigger. You don't have to have huge ones. I mean, the ones we're looking at right now, it's about 1.25 inches by 1 inch. But notice that I'm now starting to take the Letterforms, and since I've drawn the thumbnail a little more intentionally, I've been trying to get a particular kind of serif typeface, I can really start to think about how these letters will work together or not work together. So notice like the E and the Z, I'm now trying to figure out a figure-ground relationship where one will be the figure against the ground of the other one. Notice that I just dropped the K and H because they seem too similar. So I introduced a round character with a character with some straight stems. So we start to get a pretty good idea now of figure-ground relationships, but the thumbnails I'd like to see you do is actually filled in. If you fill them in, you get a good idea of whether it's going to work or not. Because now we really see whether the A and the B are going to work together. Is there enough information for your mind to close up that B? We're really using that Gestalt theory of closure. And we're also doing that with the letter A. We're cropping it off enough to make it interesting, but hopefully we're leaving enough so that the Gestalt of closure still happens and we understand that as an A. Your goal is to make some interesting combinations of letter forms where we can still understand the 2 letters. I don't know if that's happening with the E and the Z here. Here's the E and Z. Notice that I think a lot of what makes this interesting is the line relationship. When it moves to just shapes, it's a little harder to understand. But that's the requirement. It has to be just shapes, not lines. Here's the E and H. And I found something interesting. You know, the stem of the E, I bring that across the H, but I raise it up just a little bit so that I can now have the stem of the crossbar of the H as well as the crossbar of the E. Sorry, I was using the wrong term here. Also notice the cropping. The H is now tucked in right up against the edge of this shape. And again, here's the R and the O to get us a little closer to this design. This project acts kind of like a precursor to logo development. You can think about lettering that you're building, and if you put them together in interesting ways, you can really come up with some cool logos with just letters. While you're doing this, it's tedious and you're having to spend time filling in and maybe you're erasing, and it doesn't have to be perfect. These aren't letter perfect. But what it does do is it gives you time to think. And as you're drawing these things out, things will come into your mind. You know, for instance, the K and the H. On the computer, you just sit there and arrange these 2 guys and be like, oh, I'll try this out. And maybe you're happy because you finished the project. But it might not look very good. As I was drawing this, I was spending so much time on that, I was like, wow, that K and H just isn't working. I need a round form to go in there with the verticals. And that's where the H and the E came in. And then as I was drawing it a second time and shading it, I thought of the crossbar idea, elevating the E enough. And also notice how the E dips down right where the serifs come at the bottom of the H and indicate that curve. So we get it to do 2 things at once. Those kinds of things you think about when you're drawing just because it takes time.